Hi, Professor Breckeisen here, and this is week 6 for editing 1. We're going to talk about Dmytryk and some of his rules this week. So inside of the YoYo, you'll see the quiz. Please take the quiz. Watch this video, which you're already doing, and then if you need to look at the presentation, it's right there. For our second class this week, in case you miss it, we are just doing our lab, and you're going to continue your project for the HOPE project that you've been working on. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the lecture. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about Edward Dmytryk, like I said, and then a little bit on some of these rules that he uses. First, we're going to have a brief history of our continuity so we can kind of catch up where we're at, and then again talk about Edward Dmytryk. So, if you can recall from the History Week, we started off with the Lumiere brothers and how they were creating these kind of pre-stories. They were just kind of capturing moments. Some of them were kind of fun, and we could argue that they were a little bit of story if you think that story is just beginning, middle, and end. But I would argue that there needs to be a little bit more in the structure of that for it to be actual stories. So the term actualities is what we attribute to what they were creating at that time. Just as a reminder, they felt like this was a fad. It was going to kind of die off. It was something that wasn't going to last very long, but then other filmmakers were starting to create actual stories that were captivating people, and that's really what gave a lot of life to it. That's when we went to George Méliès. He was starting to create these cinematic pieces, if you will. They were more like stage plays where the camera was stationary, had the best seat inside the house. But we did start to see now editing from scene to scene to scene to scene, but it kind of kept that same look, replicating what we would have seen if we were in the playhouse, the stage play theater. Edwin Porter was one of the earlier filmmakers we looked at, started using things like parallel editing, but more importantly, we started to see that temporal overlap. That's that idea where we would see something and then we would cut, we would kind of go back in time and re-see it so that the audience could feel like they're not missing anything. We found out very early that that was not something that audiences need. You might hear some people say that audiences needed that because they weren't able to watch movies. That's not necessarily true. Filmmakers were experimenting and they were making the assumption that people needed that. They quickly found out they didn't, and so they abandoned that idea. However, we still use temporal overlap when we go to commercials and come back from commercials when there's programming that involves that. Then we looked at D.W. Griffith and some of the films and contributions that he had, and started to look at, more importantly, his contribution of moving that camera. So now we went from the stage play to actually starting to have coverage. We're able to take the member of the audience from the audience itself and bring them onto the stage and have them look at that close-up and have them participate a little bit more intimately with the story. Now, this is kind of in the norm and how things have been working. You also remember that lots of films were being created at the time. How are we creating 400 films in a year, 2 year span? That's going to require a lot of work from a lot of different people. And so we're starting to see now this kind of assembly line, this machine of filmmaking starting around this time, and that's when we get to Edward Dmytryk. We're going to talk a little bit about that assembly line era of filmmaking and how he had to invent some kind of standard for that to work. So, here he is. Some of the contributions as an editor, and then he has a book called On Filmmaking, or On Film Editing, excuse me. You can get that book. I think it's worth a good historical read. There's some things we're going to talk about that holds over true to today, but we've kind of expanded a little bit on some of his principles. But let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the problem of this assembly editing system. So, there was a time when a lot of the studios would have apartments that talent could use and stay at while they were on a production. Some of those got repurposed into offices. So now instead of being small places to live, they got turned into these nice little offices for people to use. And the people that were using that were the editors. This was a time when primarily, well, a lot of the editors were female. They were put into these rooms and they were asked to work on a film. They didn't work on one film, or one of them didn't work on a film. I should say, let me rephrase this. On a film, there could have been more than one editor, and oftentimes there were, just because we needed to get these out pretty quick. So a film could have anywhere between 2 to 8 editors, maybe more. And you can imagine that if you have 8 different people in 8 different rooms working on the same film, from scene to scene or sequence to sequence, or however they were dividing up that workload, there could be some discrepancies and some issues of how that was going to be edited together. So this idea of creating some kind of standard and some kind of rule to help make sure that the edits were somewhat similar, somewhat, working together from editor to editor became a necessity. And that's really where Dmytryk comes in and created these rules. So what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the 7 rules. Here they are. I have the important words that I want you to always remember underlined for you. And then some of them even bolded here. We're going to see how some of these apply to today, and some of them not so much. Some of them are actually 100% today, and some of them kind of morphed into something new. But these are basically the rules. So positive reason, cut long, in movement, fresh, continuing in action, proper values, and substance first is what we're going to look at. So the way that this is going to work is I'm going to present to you a rule like this one, and then I'm going to tell you what the problem was of the time, and then why that rule was going to fix that problem. So number 1, never make a cut without a positive reason. What in the world does positive reason even mean? Well, this is where we get into the idea of who are you editing for. You are editing for an audience, and you want to make edits that the audience wants to see, whether they know it because they say like, oh, I heard a noise and now I want to see this new thing, or I saw a beat on the screen and now I want to see what that person's looking at, like if they go like this and now you want to see what they're looking at. There is something that you can do to control the way the audience is thinking to want to see the edit that they're going to see. So that's really what this positive reason is. Is there a reason for the audience to want to see this next cut? And if they can, you can put it in that reason, oftentimes you're going to hide that cut. So edits felt kind of willy-nilly without purpose. One of my pet peeves is I ask an editor in class, why did you make this cut? And that student editor will be like, well, I just really felt like in the moment this is what I wanted to say. I don't care what you want to say. Your audience doesn't care what you want to say. They're not there to see your art, unfortunately. That's just the way this is. They're there to be engulfed into a movie and into an experience. Your job is to engulf them. So you are editing for them. They are not there to witness and appreciate your edits. Now, you as a filmmaker might appreciate edits, but the general population can care less. They just want to be there for the movie. So if you are just making these edits because you're so brilliant and you know everything about what you want to say, and the audience, can just take it or leave it, then you're making probably the wrong decision on why you are trying to make that edit. Now, there are rooms for those kinds of films. I'm not going to diminish that. But for the most part, if you're making narrative films, that's not the attitude to have. So that positive reason is when the audience has a tendency to see what you're cutting to. Okay? And we never force them to see that. Let me move my face here in case this is blocking. Sometimes never, okay? Most often never. Sometimes we're going to learn about how we break the rules a little bit later, but what we really want to do is we want to keep this idea of continuity, keeping the idea of keeping them engulfed in inside of the screen as much as possible, and we don't want to pull them out. So if you are just making cuts because you think that a cut should belong there, you need to step back, watch your video, watch your edit, and say, when do I feel like this is going to need to be edited to? And we'll talk more about some techniques on that as we go forward in this class. So if it's ambiguous now, we'll cover it. Rule number 2, cut long rather than short. Okay? Typo here, that should say a short or a shot. The problem here is if a shot is on for a short amount of time and there's some information that we need to see there, you as the editor have a pretty intimate understanding of that footage. You've probably seen and stared at it. You probably stopped your playhead and examined it. So for your brain to need to absorb that information, you probably only need to look at it for a fraction of a second because you already have a relationship with that footage. The audience does not have that same experience. So you need to watch your edits with a fresh audience perspective and see what they're actually seeing so they're not missing any action. Also, when we have coverage back in this era, it wasn't uncommon for there just to be a couple of shots for that entire scene. So we might have a master shot, right? Then we might have 2 close-ups, and then after we watch those close-ups, we might get out. There might not be any more coverage that's happening inside that scene. So for us to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth between 2 different shots, if we're trying to catch every piece of dialogue, sometimes that can be boring. Sometimes it's nicer just to stay back in that establishing shot for a little bit longer. Then go into the over-the-shoulder coverage, and maybe not even cut to the other person if it's not that important to see that they're saying something. Maybe we stay with somebody a little bit longer to see how they respond to what they're saying, because that's giving us a little bit more engagement into the story. So we can actually kind of slow our cuts down a little bit by doing that. Cutting longer can also ruin continuity or cause temporal overlap. That temporal overlap is going to sometimes be caused because there's some inaccuracies inside of the edit. So we want to make sure that we're not catching those, we're not displaying those inaccuracies that happen. All right. However, sometimes it's better to break that continuity and to cause that temporal overlap if it means that we keep our audience engaged a little bit more. The interesting thing about continuity is that you as the editor can get very blinded by continuity mistakes that you have to fix. I see a lot of times young editors having to make sure that if somebody's walking left, right, when they cut to another angle of them walking, they need to make sure that the next footstep, left, right, matches perfectly. There might be a dialogue going on, there might be a reaction to something that's being said, but that takes second place over the continuity of these footprints or these footsteps. That is an error in editing. No one's going to care about the footsteps. We're engaging in the story and the faces of what's happening. And so if we are engaged in what they're talking about, how they're reacting to each other, that is when we make our cuts. So be very careful about this rule of continuity, and we're going to look at that a little bit more as we go through. So break continuity or causing overlap to the audience so the audience can digest what's in the shot can sometimes be okay. So be careful how you approach those. It's also easy to have things, like I said, play out into 2 shots or even over the shoulders for a little bit longer, so we avoid that back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth tendency of cutting. And the reason why that's really bad is your brain and the audience member's brain is really good about knowing what's going on. And so we want to keep things visually interesting so that they keep their eyes glued to the screen. If there ever becomes a point where you're watching a film and you're just seeing the same 2 images over and over again, you can literally close your eyes and just listen, and you will see the cuts even though you're not looking at the screen. And your brain will remember what those shots look like, and you will have picked up that pattern of how those edits are happening. So if we can close our eyes, then we miss whatever product placement we have in there. We might be able to get up and go make a sandwich and just listen to the shot or listen to the program on the TV from the other room. And we don't want to do that. We want to keep our eyes glued on the screen as much as possible. So try to avoid that repetition, which will give the audience a reason to just kind of like check out for a minute. All right, so an example here is a man is looking for something when his phone rings, and we cut to a point of view to see who's calling, but we don't stay on that point of view long enough to see that it's an important thing as he hits delete or hits like don't answer, whatever that is, cancel, hits cancel. But if we don't get to see, oh, who was it that was calling, we might miss something important. And you as the editor goes, well, obviously it's his wife, he's over at his girlfriend's house, and he's not going to answer that phone, but you have an intimate relationship with that footage, you know what it is, but you didn't give the audience enough time to see that. Let me move this in case you need to read that. I'm not sure if my face is in the way, I can't see it. All right, so that's rule number 2, cut long rather than short, so that we can maintain some interest, and also so that we're not ruining some of the takes. Number 3, When impossible, cut in movement. Now this is a very, very important one, and this is something that we have today. This is our magic trick of editing. So when we say that edits are felt, that's usually because the audience has to like not look at the screen anymore, but kind of glance around what to look at. What we want to do is we want to lead the eye from place to place, or give them the reason to look somewhere else and to expect to look there. And we'll look at some strategies how to do that with our next editor that we're going to look at. But right now we want to make sure that movement is being addressed. So movement can hide an edit. So if we have like a medium shot, kind of like what you have right now of me, and I go to stand up, and then you go to a wide shot of me, I should be continuing that motion of standing up. And it's really amazing that we go from something very drastic as a close-up or medium close-up to a wide shot of somebody, and we don't feel like we've moved at all. Sometimes someone will say like, oh, that was a good edit, and someone else will go, what edit? I mean, it was a drastic change, but that movement helped us to hide it. So motion on the screen can hide a cut. Similar to magic, so like how sleight of hand magic works, large motions will always help cover small motions. So if I take my ring, for example, and I hold it here in front of the lens and I go like this, all of a sudden here, it's gone. And where is it? Back on my hand. So how did that happen? That's crazy, but that's how that editing magic kind of works. It also helps the audience's eyes flow from shot to shot. So here we have an example for a man reaching for their phone. Okay, we already used this one. As he reaches, we cut to the insert of the phone. So as the hand goes to reach for the phone, we're going to then cut to the phone as the hand comes into the shot and actually reaches and grabs the phone. And that's really the way that kind of works. Again, so that the magic of the motion hides the shots. Rule number 4. Fresh is preferable to the stale. This kind of goes back a little bit to our fast cutting, but we want to be able to keep things fresh on the screen. So there's a little bit of a contradiction here with these two. So we need to be careful with our productions that we are creating enough visual interest if we're keeping a shot long enough so that it doesn't become too stale. So back and forth editing between the same two shots over the shoulders or singles, like we talked about before, is part of this as well. We want to keep that audience interested. Again, if they can close their eyes and see the shots again, then we want to avoid that. So it's important that on our productions or on a production that we're editing for, if we weren't there, has adequate coverage. So it has that master shot. It's got those matching over the shoulders. Maybe it's got two matching over the shoulders, one with a wider lens, one with a longer lens, so we can start to get that depth of field. Then we get some close-ups. Maybe we get two sets of close-up, medium close-ups, and then close-ups, so that we can really get into seeing how the audience feels. We're going to be able to tell the story a little bit better. We're going to be able to get in with a lot more real estate and be fresh with our shots. So the example here is a 4-minute dialogue between a man and a woman at a dinner table, right? If the same setup over the shoulder, back, over the shoulder, over the shoulder, over the shoulder, over the shoulder, over the shoulder is used, that can be stale. And you might be saying, Tommy, I've seen enough movies where they actually do this and they keep my interest. Yes, they're keeping your interest because the dialogue is keeping your interest. So this can work as long as there's something in the shot that is still fresh. Dialogue can be fresh, but we want to be careful that if things aren't progressing very much, if the dialogue or the story part isn't as interesting, we want to be able to maintain that interest through our edits as well. So rule number 5, shots or scenes should begin and end with continuing action. So the problem here was, and this is a little bit of an older problem that we don't really focus on too much now, but the idea was that if we saw a character do something as they end a scene, we want to see them kind of continue that as we begin. And so a classic example is somebody gets up and walks out of a door. Let's say they're mad at their boss and they're like, I quit, and they get up and they storm out and they go to the door. We want to, if we're going to catch up with them in the hallway, we should catch up with them in the hallway as they're exiting the door. So we go from one shot where they're going towards the door, they open the door to leave, we cut, they come out of the room. Not temporal overlap, right? We want to make sure that the cut looks good, but that action is the same here to there. Now, a less obvious one than that would be if this person is like, that's it, I quit and I'm going home, and the next thing we see is them in their bedroom. maybe with a bottle of alcohol and some pills, right? That's where they're at in their mind space. This rule would say that as they get up and slam the door and leave, when we cut to them coming into their room, we want them to come into the door, get the bottle, get the pills, sit on the bed. Now we kind of move a little bit faster than that, and audiences are a little bit more forgiving. So that same scene could be to get up and go and slam out the door, cut to somebody already on the bed. We don't need to see all that middle stuff. We kind of forgive it a little bit more. So this is one of those rules where it could be a little bit not as strict as before. So to create smooth transitions between scenes of between the character and the audience, that's what we're trying to do. So, another great example down here is characters moving out of a scene to a static shot. That's what I was talking about. But this other one here is characters traveling. If characters are traveling, from this screen to this screen, so I guess, I don't know if this is right to left or left to right, I don't know if this flips around, but from here to here, the next cut we should see them continuing to move, continuing to move, continuing to move. So if it's a driving scene and they're driving from work to home, and then the next shot, next shot, if they change direction in the shot, then we can start picking up this way, this way. So we want to make sure that that continuity is being followed and created at all times. That's a little bit of a production thing. They need to do that in production to make sure to have that actually work, but that also falls in line here with this one. Rule number 6, cut for proper values rather than proper matches. All right, so sometimes what we want to do is we want to make everything in the edit perfect. This goes back to me talking about the footsteps, right? But we can also look at things like liquid in a glass. We want to make sure that that liquid is perfect, that when they put the glass down, that it looks like they had that much in there. So we're going to look for the take that had the exact same amount, right? Even though it's kind of fluctuates because they're on set and they're not keeping track of that. Script supervisor might not be perfectly looking at that. That cigarette ash is exactly the same length in every single shot. And if we start to look for those continuity errors, or to fixing those continuity errors, we could be sacrificing the story. So this kind of addresses that same issue. Remember that the story comes first, and what I mean by the story, it's the engagement of the characters that are going through what they're going through in the audience, not necessarily the structure, first, second, third act. It's the thing that's happening and how somebody's reacting to it is what's most important. So we want to get involved and engulfed into that situation. So if you can listen to your scene, this is a good tip, with your eyes closed, especially if there's dialogue, then and it makes sense and there's no weird pauses or anybody stepping on each other when it's not supposed to happen, then you probably have a really good scene as far as dialogue goes. Then all you need to do is come back in and start massaging where your cuts are going to be. So in a heavy dialogue scene, edit your audio first and then go in and try to massage where your cuts are going to be. So the example that we have here on the bottom are two kids playing tic-tac-toe. Kids are notoriously difficult to work with. They don't understand continuity, especially if they're a lot younger, and they don't have the patience or the experience to know that you need the exact same thing over and over again. That is a learned skill and something that takes a little bit more cognition of relating to other people outside of yourself, that sometimes kids, especially younger ones, they just don't have that yet. That's not in their brain. So if they're playing tic-tac-toe on the sidewalk and the story's going through and you start to see that one kid's putting an X here, an X over here, an X over here, you want to match exactly where those are going, but you're ignoring the conversation that's happening. Allow the continuity errors of the X's to be off, but focus on the story, focus on the dialogue, and make sure that that's good, because that'll get you where you need to be. I'll pull this out of the way in case you need to read that. You can pause if you need to. All right, last one. Rule number 7, substance first, then form. Okay, this means that rules sometimes can get in the way. If the rule is to cut long rather than short, but short makes the story go by better, then cut short. If we have to ruin the continuity, like we said, ruin the continuity. If we have to ruin the direction that the continuing action, then ruin the continuing action. If we have to ruin the movement, like somebody goes to stand up and then we cut to wide and they kind of stand up again, I guess it's another continuity thing, but it kind of falls in that line of the action, then ruin that if the story is what's going to make more sense at the end of the day. So let the story be the ruler, but let these things come in if they need to. All right, I'm going to go back to this first slide here where where I showed everything and kind of recap and talk a little bit about today. So never make a cut without a positive reason is absolutely important today. In fact, this is a big reason or a big contributor to a lot of modern film theory that we're going to be using when it comes to editing. If anything on this list, that one is probably the most important. Then I would say cutting and movement would be the next important. Cutting long rather than short, that one doesn't really apply today. We have a lot of shots that are very short. Our aesthetic for what we're watching is a little bit different, especially if it's a high action film. Sometimes those short cuts can be a lot of fun. It can add a lot of action, a lot of drama. So cut appropriate to the action that we see on the screen is what I would change that to. Whenever possible, cut and movement. Yes, absolutely. Again, that is the magic trick of what we're talking about, and it goes hand in hand with rule number 1 a little bit. Fresh is preferable to the stale. I would say that really applies to today, but we are allowed to use other things other than the editing to keep things fresh. So we do like our dialogue heavy movies now. They're kind of part of what we're doing. And we like to stay with things a little bit longer just because I think we're just it's just a little bit more intimate with what the story is. But having a little bit of camera movement with those long shots always adds a little bit of cinematic flair to what you're doing. Shots should begin and end with continuing action. Not necessarily. I think that's okay to have in there, but as long as it makes sense, as long as the emotion of your story is correct, you should be fine. Proper values rather than proper matches. Yes, that's true. We don't want to sacrifice the story for continuity. Sometimes we're allowed to let the continuity slide. Yes, as the editor, you are going to be absolutely driven bananas because, again, you're going to be blinded to that situation because you can see it and you see it all the time and you're replaying it and replaying it. But sometimes when an audience sees it for the first, second, third, fourth time, they never catch it. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And last is substance first, then form, of course. Story comes first, and then do the rules. So don't let the rules get in the way of doing what you need to do. All right, let's look at this fun video here, and what I want us to do is kind of focus a little bit on some of the continuity errors that we're gonna look at, and then we'll come back and kind of talk about it.
Creating a full-length feature film is a huge job for any director. Movie making is a storm of actors, set designs, production assistants, and the cameras catching them all. The finished movie is really just a tiny glimpse of the actual work that goes into making it. Usually it's the editor's job to make sure that what's outside of each shot stays there, but they're only human, which means some really incredible mistakes can make their way into the final product and be seen by millions. Here are Screen Rant's 10 movie mistakes that slip through editing. The Bourne Identity. We can't deny that Matt Damon's role as Jason Bourne helped redefine the modern spy thriller. In The Bourne Identity, Damon plays a CIA assassin who suffers from amnesia.
What's your name?
I don't know.
But also has superhuman levels of stealth and battlefield awareness. At least he's supposed to. At one point, Bourne is rescued from the sea by a fishing crew. When he first arrives on land, he literally disappears into the surrounding city. If you're not paying close attention, you're probably thinking, this guy's the real deal. But if you take a closer look, you'll notice a pair of extras trying to conceal Damon as he ducks behind a truck with his feet and his bright red jacket clearly visible. Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. By the time Chamber of Secrets rolled around, Harry Potter and Draco Malfoy were already each other's worst enemies. So it's no surprise that when the children of Hogwarts began their training in magical duels, the two wound up crossing wands. As always, Harry winds up getting the better of his foe to the delight of the students watching. The students and the cameraman, who the director either didn't notice or somehow assumed audiences wouldn't spot. How this unplanned cameo wasn't defeated by some editing magic is beyond us. Back to the Future. Aside from the questions of time travel and parallel universes, Marty McFly's trip backwards and forwards through the decades is home to a few small mistakes and inconsistencies. But it's the most inconsequential error of the bunch that's become the most well-known, and frankly, the most unsettling. When Doc Brown returns with his family in tow in the final scene of the trilogy, his youngest son offers a gesture that can never be missed once you know it's there. Most people accept the young actor was just signaling that he needed to use the washroom, but we're not buying it. Don't they have toilets on time-traveling trains? Jurassic Park. Steven Spielberg's dinosaur adventure has aged better than most other special effects-driven films. The credit is usually given to Spielberg's use of real dinosaur models, along with completely CGI creatures. But that decision didn't come without a few drawbacks. No fan will forget the scene where a pair of raptors pursues the movie's child stars through the park's kitchen. But it turns out the dinosaur models were a little less graceful than their CG versions, apparently needing a crew member's hand to keep their balance. The Hurt Locker. It isn't just dinosaurs that can use a hand from an off-screen crew member. The Hurt Locker tells the story of a bomb disposal team deployed during the Iraq War, but soldiers on the ground had more to worry about than just explosives. Someone on the film's set decided that Jeremy Renner needed some help moving through a curtain of plastic sheeting as he investigates an enemy-controlled warehouse. The crew member ends up putting his entire hand into the frame. It's a mystery why the shot wasn't cut a moment sooner, which leads us to believe it was probably missed altogether. Gladiator. In a film as massive as Ridley Scott's Roman epic, audiences are willing to overlook some small mistakes. But the director really put that theory to the test. Gladiator is peppered with too many mistakes to count. There's the crew member who somehow stumbled onto a shot as Maximus greets a Roman horse. There's the barbarian extras who decide to take a break in the middle of a fierce battle. There's even an exposed air canister used to flip a chariot in the Roman Colosseum. There's even some visible body padding used to protect an actor from arrows and swords. But nothing beats the famous question Russell Crowe asks after he single-handedly wipes out a bunch of opponents.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
It's taken as a political statement for those watching the fight, but it was clearly directed at the camera crew visible in a wider shot. Jaws. When word first breaks of a man-eating shark off the shores of Amity, everyone in possession of a boat takes off in search of the bounty placed on the great white's head. The chaos that follows is a nightmare for Police Chief Brody, but it's clearly perfect for the filmmakers. Apparently, director Steven Spielberg got so captivated by the excitement, he assumed audiences wouldn't notice the entire camera crew's boat visible in the middle of the frame. Raiders of the Lost Ark. Given the number of extras used and how large some of the movie's action sequences were, a mistake or two is bound to happen. Take, for example, the reflection of the entire camera crew in the cockpit of a Nazi aircraft, or the infamous gun versus sword sequence starring the world's worst butcher. But the film's most ridiculous mistake is also its most ironic. To make sure the Tunisian backdrop resembles 1936 Cairo, the crew famously removed over 300 TV antennas from surrounding rooftops. That level of dedication pays off in the finished film, until a man wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt strolls through the background just minutes later. The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. The second chapter of Peter Jackson's fantasy trilogy begins with three of the Fellowship stumbling into the land of Rohan. This leads to a tense introduction with Éomer, a noble soldier and an ally in the rest of the story. Of course, Éomer embodies nothing but honor and dignity, so he ends the standoff by giving his new allies horses and sends them on their way. Unfortunately, his sword slides right out of his sheath in the process. He's clearly too embarrassed to acknowledge the mistake, and we can only assume he left as quickly as possible to find a replacement. Frozen. Just because animated films are created a single frame at a time, that doesn't mean mistakes don't slip by just as easily. One of the most well-known sequences in Disney's smash hit Frozen stars the magical Queen Elsa embracing her powers with the performance of the award-winning song Let It Go. In all the excitement, the artist decided to let the laws of physics go as well. As Elsa lets down her hair, her braid jumps from behind her back to over her shoulder, passing right through her left arm. The ability to control ice and snow and create an eternal winter is one thing, but we have to draw the line somewhere.
All right, so either one of two things just happened for you. One, you some of your favorite movies just got ruined a little bit. But you either sit there and said, hey, these things happen and I can't believe I've never noticed them before, or you're sitting there going, boy, I thought editing was a little bit more hard and they were a little bit more professional and didn't let these kind of things slide. Well, I have to be on the side of the editors in this just a little bit. Here, I'm going to come to full screen. And that's because, again, going back to these rules, all those continuity errors, most likely if you saw those movies before, just watching these clips, you would never even notice that. And if you watch these clips over and over and over again, you probably never notice that. Even to the point where he has to show this, in order for him to prove his point, he's got to stop the film and circle things and put arrows. So that already shows us that it's not that obvious to have continuity errors to the audience. So if the audience can miss it, and if big budget films like these are using these continuity errors so that they can tell the story, be okay that you have a little bit of these errors to tell the story. Don't let these get in the way of the emotion and the story that we're going to be watching throughout this. All right. So, continue your Hope project and contact me if you have any questions. Hopefully, things are going well, and I'll see you on the next lecture. Bye, Bamel.